All right, so today we're tackling one of the biggest, most complicated moments in American history, the Civil War. Now, this wasn't something that just happened overnight. It was more like a series of deep, growing cracks that finally shattered the nation. So, let's get right into it.
To really get to the heart of this conflict, you have to start right here. These are the words of the incredible abolitionist Frederick Douglass, and he's speaking way back in 1852. He is just cutting right through all the noise and pointing out this massive hypocrisy. How can you celebrate freedom in a country where millions of people are enslaved? You see, this was never just a political disagreement. It was a massive moral crisis.
And that really brings us to this central question we're trying to answer here. How did we get to this point? A country that was literally founded on the idea of liberty, plunging itself into a brutal war over the practice of slavery. Well, we're going to unpack the four main causes that made this conflict pretty much inevitable.
Okay, so first things first. The biggest and most fundamental cause was, without a doubt, the institution of slavery itself. It was the original sin, the crack in the foundation of the country, from the very beginning. As Abraham Lincoln famously said, it created a house divided. And, pushing back against this horrific system was a growing and really powerful movement of people we call abolitionists. These were men and women whose mission was simple, it was clear, and it was non-negotiable. Slavery in America had to end. Period.
And what's so amazing about this movement is just how many different voices were a part of it. I mean, you had writers and journalists like William Lloyd Garrison and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was a total game changer, exposing the brutal reality of slavery to millions. But, the most powerful voices of all came from people who had actually escaped slavery themselves. People like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth, who could share firsthand what they had suffered.
Just listen to these words from Sojourner Truth. Can you feel the pain and the strength in that? This wasn't some abstract political argument for her. This was her life. This was raw, human testimony about the absolute cruelty of the system. And that moral power is what fueled the abolitionist movement and made it impossible to just compromise on the issue. So this huge moral divide leads directly to our second cause, sectionalism. The country wasn't just having a disagreement anymore. It was actually splitting into two very different societies with two completely different ways of life. And this is what sectionalism is all about. It's this growing belief that your first loyalty isn't to the United States as a whole, but to your specific region. People were starting to see themselves as Southerners or Northerners first, and Americans as a distant second. And you can see why. The North was rapidly becoming an industrial economy full of factories and cities, and they wanted a strong federal government to help their businesses. But the South? Its entire economy was agricultural, totally dependent on plantations and the labor of enslaved people. So they pushed hard for states' rights to make sure the federal government couldn't touch their system. These weren't just small differences. They were two competing worlds on a collision course. Now, with the country literally pulling itself apart at the seams, politicians were scrambling. They tried to hold it all together with a bunch of political compromises, but as you're about to see, every attempt to patch things up just made the cracks even wider. For decades, Washington just kept kicking the can down the road. First, there was the Missouri Compromise back in 1820. Then, the Compromise of 1850. After that, the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. Each one was basically a band-aid, trying to keep the number of free states and slave states balanced. But they all danced around the real issue. You can't really compromise on whether or not human beings can be owned as property. The big idea behind these later deals was this concept called popular sovereignty. Now, on the surface, it sounds kind of democratic, right? Just let the people who move into new territories vote for themselves on whether to allow slavery. What could go wrong? Well, the problem is you're asking people to vote on the most explosive moral issue in the country. And yeah, that's exactly what happened. Popular sovereignty didn't lead to peaceful votes and handshakes. It turned political disagreements into actual physical battlegrounds. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act leads directly to Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers literally flooded the territory and started killing each other. Then the Supreme Court drops the Dred Scott decision, which basically said that African Americans weren't citizens and had no rights. And finally, you get John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, where he tried to start a massive slave uprising. The time for talking was over. The violence had begun.
So, by 1860, the nation is an absolute powder keg. It's just sitting there waiting for a spark. And that spark turned out to be the presidential election.
When Abraham Lincoln ran for president, his main platform was about stopping the spread of slavery into new territories. For the South, this was a direct attack on their entire economic system and their political power. His victory was, for them, the point of no return.
And if you want proof of how fractured the country was, just look at the popular vote from that election. I mean, look at these numbers. You have 4 different candidates getting a huge chunk of the vote. Lincoln actually won the presidency with less than 40% of the popular vote. That just shows you how deeply divided the nation really was.
And if you need one more piece of evidence, this is it. 0. That's how many electoral votes Abraham Lincoln got from the southern states. Not a single one. He was a president elected entirely by the North. As far as the South was concerned, they had no voice, no power left in the government.
So what was the South's response? It was immediate, and it was dramatic: secession. State by state, they began to formally leave the United States to try and form their own new country, which they called the Confederacy.
And that was it. The path was set. All 4 of these causes, the moral poison of slavery, the deep cultural divide of sectionalism, the constant failure of politicians to fix it, and finally, the trigger of the 1860 election, they all came together to make a civil war inevitable.
So let's just recap it real quick. It's like a 4-step countdown to disaster. Step 1, you start with the fundamental evil of slavery. Step 2, that creates 2 totally different societies that can't coexist. Step 3, every attempt to compromise just blows up in everyone's faces and leads to violence. And step 4, a single election finally breaks the whole system. Each step just led, tragically, right into the next.
Which leaves us with a really big question to think about. One that's just as relevant now as it was then. We just saw how trying to compromise failed spectacularly. So it makes you wonder, when is compromise a good thing, a tool that holds society together? And when does it become dangerous, a way of enabling something that's just plain wrong? It's a question they struggled with then, and it's one we're still grappling with today.